most people that read the Bible don't read the original Hebrew and Greek, but rather they read through a translation. The thing is, though, different English translations are based off of a different Greek text for the New Testament. And the question is, which Greek text is the right one to use for translation? There is a huge amount of confusion on this question, all kinds of strange ideas that people have. And I'm by no means an expert on this question, but I've studied this enough and I have enough of an understanding, I think, to give a simple introduction to the subject for the typical non scholar Christian out there who wants to know which Greek text should be the right one for my English translation of the Bible. There are over 5,800 total manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. What does that mean? Well, before the days of the printing press, nowadays, if somebody writes something, a book or something, you type it up and it's saved to the internet and it's there and you have it, right? And you can everybody can just read it and you can print it whenever you want. But before the days of not only the internet, but before the days of the printing press, everything was done by hand. So we don't have the original New Testament. We don't have the original Gospel of John. We don't have the original letter to the Romans by Paul. These things were written down by hand on papyrus, and the autographs, they were disintegrated centuries and centuries ago, right? So what happened was when the Gospel of John was written, when the letter to the Romans was written, when the New Testament was written, these things were copied by hand by scribes, and then in fulfillment of the Great Commission, they went to the ends of the earth with the New Testament, and they kept making copies wherever they went. So the copies are very, very good. 85% of all manuscripts are in agreement, and the 15% disagreement is for the most part very trivial, like difference in word order or difference in spelling for the most part. There's a few important differences, but the agreement is massive. But because human beings are doing the copies, no two manuscripts are exactly identical. There's variations between the different ones, right? So one of the most important things to consider in this question is the question of what are called textual families. So I mentioned before that as the Great Commissions are being fulfilled, as copies are being made, people are going to different parts of the world, different locations, different areas. And as Christians go to a certain part of the world and start making copies of the New Testament, they tend to keep copying the same set of manuscripts in that location, right? And so if a mistake is made in a certain place, and that mistake gets copied, you start to see sort of the same sorts of mistakes being copied over and over again. And so what ends up happening is New Testament scholars have been able to kind of categorize most of the manuscripts that we have into three main textual families. And those families are called the Alexandrian, the Byzantine, and the Western textual families. And these names are based off of the main locations where we find these manuscripts. The Alexandrian manuscripts are basically been found in Egypt. The Byzantine manuscripts, the manuscripts that belong to that textual family, those are found throughout the former Byzantine Empire in the Greek-speaking world. And then what are called the Western manuscripts, those are found in the western part of the Roman Empire. So again, what we mean by textual families is manuscripts that share certain similarities. There's all these variations that occurred in all the Greek manuscripts, and certain manuscripts are more alike to each other in the same sorts of ways than others. And the ones that share certain commonalities are grouped together under the name textual families. So first of all, just to consider how many there are of these different manuscripts, the ones that are called Alexandrian, there's between 30 to 200 of these manuscripts. And the reason that there's some pretty big range there is because it's not a clear-cut science, because, no two Alexandrian manuscripts are the same. And some manuscripts have certain Alexandrian variants, but also certain Byzantine variants or certain Western variants. Some of these manuscripts are mixtures. Some of these manuscripts aren't complete copies of the New Testament. They're just, a fragment of one gospel or one part of one gospel or something, right? And you can't really tell for sure just from a little passage which family it mostly belongs to. But you can see that the number is very small, 30 to 200 roughly, whereas the Byzantine text family, there's over 5,000. About 90% or more of all Greek manuscripts that we have belong to the Byzantine family. And when it comes to the Western, there's really only one manuscript that is considered to be thoroughly Western, but there are lots of different documents, lots of different manuscripts that have certain readings within them that are considered to be Western. Um, what are the characteristics of each of these families? Well, the Alexandrian family is characterized by a shorter text for the most part. Not always, but often the Alexandrian text is shorter, whereas the Byzantine text is a bit longer. You will hear sometimes people talk about the missing verses in modern Bible translations. This is what they're talking about, is that translations that are based off the Alexandrian family of Greek manuscripts often don't have certain verses in them that are found in translations based off of Byzantine Greek manuscripts. Alexandrian manuscripts are also characterized by more difficult readings. Readings that don't, at first glance, make quite as much sense. They seem a little bit surprising or less expected. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well, compared to the Byzantine. Also, they're less harmonized. So, for example, when you compare parallel passages within the Gospels, let's say between the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, the Byzantine manuscripts tend to harmonize these, or tend to reflect a harmonization, where it seems that the parallel account in Matthew and Luke will look more similar in the Byzantine manuscripts, whereas there might be more differences in Alexandrian manuscripts. The Western text is characterized by paraphrase. It's characterized by seeming like they're taking some liberty with the text and adding additional information and things like that, and also more harmonization. What English translations are based off of each of these different textual families? Well, the Alexandrian textual family is represented by the NIV, the ESV, the NASB, the CSB, basically every modern translation, for the most part, except for the King James Version and the New King James Version. Those are based off of the Byzantine text family. And no well-known Bible translations are based off the Western text family. Basically, no scholars believe that the Western is closest to the original. But that's the question. That's what we're trying to get at, is which of these textual families most closely represents the original New Testament? All right, so what are some of the arguments for the Alexandrian text? Well, why, I said before that only a very small percentage of the Greek manuscripts that we found are Alexandrian. But then why are almost all of the modern English translations based off of this family of manuscripts? Well, here's some of the reasons. First of all, these manuscripts are very, very early. Even though there's not a lot of them, the ones that we found are very, very old. The two most important that we found are called Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. These are the two earliest, most complete New Testaments that have been found. And they're dated to the 4th century, meaning the 300s AD. So very, very early. Not only that, but some of the early papyri. Remember I said before that not only complete New Testaments, but we've found fragments or portions of certain parts of the New Testament. Some of these fragments in the papyri that we found are from the 2nd century, meaning the 100s AD. So very, very early. And a lot of those papyri do reflect Alexandrian family of manuscripts. A second argument for the Alexandrian text is the Church Fathers. Think about this. Some of the early Christians, Ignatius, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Athanasius, some of these guys, Origen, if these guys are quoting from the New Testament, that actually gives us some important information. We can ask, what text were they quoting from? When Origen is quoting from the New Testament, what text did he have in front of him that he was quoting from? And a lot of times these church fathers, it seems like what they were quoting from was a largely Alexandrian text. So that gives some scholars the indication that, okay, the early text of the New Testament was closest to being Alexandrian. Another argument is the study of scribal habits. So scholars tend to prefer shorter texts, thinking that they're more likely original. Remember we said before the Alexandrian text tends to be shorter than the Byzantine. And the reason is, like, let's go back to the example we mentioned before. You have the Gospel of Matthew, let's say, and the Gospel of Luke, and you come to a parallel account where Matthew and Luke are recording the same account, the same event. Let's say that there's extra verses in Matthew's version than there are in Luke's. They don't exactly read the same. Well, the argument is that scribes that are copying down Luke would tend to fill in the verses that are omitted from Matthew's account into Luke's account, so that they match each other more. They're more harmonized with each other. They read more the same way. That's kind of the argument there. So the argument then would be that the one that's missing the verses would be more likely original than the one that has the extra verses in it, right? And then another argument about scribal habits is that the more difficult reading is more likely original. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let me give you an example from Mark 1 verse 41. Kind of a dramatic example. So the New King James reads this: Then Jesus moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. The NIV says Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. So this, of course, is the account of the leper that fell down before Jesus. Which, I mean, you read these two side by side and you say, where did the NIV get the idea he's indignant? That seems crazy that Jesus would, I mean, isn't it much more natural to think he was filled with compassion when he stretched out his hand? Why would he be angry with this guy? Why would he be indignant? And so that's actually the argument. That's why the NIV translated it that way. This is a manuscript difference. Some manuscripts say compassion, some say indignant. And when the NIV translators are trying to decide which one is more likely original, the thinking is, well, what scribe in their right mind would change the word compassion into the word indignant? Nobody would do that because that wouldn't make any sense. But it would make sense for a scribe to come to this verse if it said indignant and think, wow, that doesn't sound very good. Let's change it to compassion. That makes a lot more sense. And so the argument is that the reading that's more difficult is more likely original than the easier one. Here's the thing, just an interesting, an important point. There's actually only one Greek manuscript that says indignant. Every other manuscript that we have says filled with compassion here. All right, what are some arguments against the Alexandrian text? I already mentioned that there's not very many of them. There are few of them. But not only are they few and limited in number, but they're also limited geographically. By that I mean that we've only found Alexandrian-type manuscripts in the region around Alexandria, in Egypt. So, if you're only finding a certain family of manuscripts in one limited geographic region, it makes you kind of wonder, did this manuscript family actually represent the entire Christian world? In other words, were Christians in Spain and in Rome and in Jerusalem and in Turkey, were they using the same manuscripts that were being used there in Egypt at the time? Or were these unique differences that are found in this particular family, the Alexandrian family, were those just unique to that location there in Egypt? Perhaps even more important is the Egyptian climate. I said before that the earliest manuscripts that have been discovered are Alexandrian manuscripts that have the features of the Alexandrian text type. But that's because the earliest manuscripts that we found are all found in Egypt. And the reason the earliest manuscripts we found are in Egypt is because the Egyptian climate uniquely preserves papyri. Papyri is a material that doesn't preserve super well. It's pretty fragile and doesn't last super long. But the dry climate of Egypt, it did a tremendously better job of preserving papyri than anywhere else in the world. And so we don't have early manuscripts from anywhere else in the world except for in Alexandria. Again, the idea of the earliest being, assuming that the earliest is better, well, what we're really doing is we're looking at the climate there in Egypt. That's really the issue. And the same thing is true for the church fathers. we don't have extensive quotations from church fathers in other places of the world except in Alexandria, in the region there near Egypt, because again, their papyri have not been preserved because of the climate. So that's very, very important to consider. Um, Another thing is that there are huge disagreements between Alexandrian manuscripts. I mentioned before the two most important manuscripts we have are Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. In the Gospels alone, those two manuscripts vary 3,036 times. Now, again, the variations are not normally very important, but some of them are. And that's just in the Gospels. So if there's not a substantial agreement between even Alexandrian manuscripts, then it makes it difficult for us to conclude that the Alexandrian family has faithfully preserved the original autographs that were written. Maybe the most important argument, as well as this, is that there is no explanation. If the Alexandrian family is truly the best representative of the original, then what's the explanation for the fact that the Byzantine family has come to dominate all the manuscripts? Like I said before, 90% of manuscripts are Byzantine. There's got to be some explanation for that. It's certainly possible that a small minority of manuscripts, the Alexandrian ones, are actually closer to the original. That's definitely possible, but that would require some kind of historical explanation. How did that happen? We know from history that the Byzantine manuscripts came to dominate very early. In the 4th century, they were already becoming the most common type of manuscripts that we find. And that became all the more the case as time went by. We also know that all the significant differences between manuscripts came into being in the first 2 centuries, not later than that. So some of you might be familiar with Westcott and Hort. They're the two text critical scholars back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who really pushed for using the Alexandrian text as the basis for the New Testament. They said that the Byzantine text is not as close to the original. The Alexandrian is better. And that's really where we've gotten to the modern idea that all the modern translations are based off of Alexandrian manuscripts. So Westcott and Hort, they recognize there's got to be some explanation for this. How did the Byzantine text become so dominant if it wasn't the original? And their theory was there was a historical revision, that during the 4th century, the Christian, there was some kind of a Christian council where they decided to come up with an official Greek New Testament, and they came up with the Byzantine one. And that, they started to just copy nothing but Byzantine manuscripts after that point, and that's why the Alexandrian text kind of faded away, and the Byzantine text became dominant. Problem is, there's absolutely zero historical evidence that happened, and modern scholars reject that theory completely. Even scholars today who say the Alexandrian text is more faithful and original, they don't agree with Westcott and Hort's historical theory. So they're left with no explanation. How did the Byzantine text become dominant? That's a really important question that needs to be answered. Another thing is scribal habits. I said before that there's an assumption that that shorter readings are more likely original and more difficult readings are more likely original. But that's based on, I think, a wrong assumption that scribes typically made errors intentionally. For example, the scribes, as they're copying, are intentionally trying to harmonize between Matthew and Luke. Or that a scribe comes across a text that they don't think makes sense, and they're intentionally changing it to try to make it make more sense. But actually, we know from our study of scribal habits that the vast majority of scribal errors are accidental. And usually the accident is by omission. It's actually, if you're going to make an accidental mistake, you're more likely to skip over something than you are to accidentally add something. And also, if you're going to make an accidental mistake, you're more likely to make a mistake that makes the reading more difficult and harder to understand. When we make a typo, usually it makes less sense than if we hadn't made the typo. So actually, I think the study of scribal habits would lend support more to the Byzantine text than to the Alexandrian text. All right, I wanted to discuss what I think is a problem with the way that the modern critical text of the Greek New Testament is compiled. By that I mean, you know, modern scholars, they go through all the different manuscripts and they try to figure out what is most likely original. And one problem with it is it results in what some call zero support Frankenstein verses. What do we mean by that? Well, let's look at an example from Mark 11, verse 3. And we'll print it here in both the King James and in the ESV. I'll just read it in the ESV. If this is where Jesus is getting ready to go into Jerusalem and he's taking the donkey, he says to his disciples, "If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately.'" So there's two different textual variants in this verse. The first is colored in blue, and it has to do with whether the word translated "that" should be included or not. You see, the King James says, "Say ye that the Lord hath need of him." ESV says, "Say the Lord has need of him." It doesn't have the word "that." Some Greek manuscripts include that word, some don't. So a decision has to be made whether that word should be included or not. The second variant is at the end of the verse, and it has to do with the word that the ESV translates "back." Notice the ESV says, "Send it back here." The King James says, "Send him hither." So the ESV includes the word "back," the King James does not. So the question, again, has to be decided whether that word should be included or not. Okay, well, the critical text that the ESV is based off of, when they got to the first variant, they went through the manuscripts and they decided that the word "that" should not be included, so they did not include it. Then they came to the second variant, and they went through and they decided that the word "back" should be included. The problem is that the manuscripts that don't have the word "that" are different from the manuscripts that do have the word "back." So they used one set of manuscripts to make the first decision and a different set of manuscripts to make the second decision. And the problem with that is that the result, the combination of these two, having no word "that" and having the word "back," that's not found in any manuscript that we've ever found before. This is the Greek text behind this verse in the ESV doesn't exist anywhere in any manuscript or any quotation from church fathers. The thing is, this happens over 100 times in the critical text, where they go variant by variant. They look at the first variant in a verse and they say that we think that this is the original. And then they come to a different variant later in the same verse and they come up with a decision, but it's based off of different manuscripts that that contradict each other. So first, I want to point out that this is not, in this verse, it's not really a big deal, is it? I mean, you would hardly notice. How important is it to have the word "that" there or not? How important is it to have the word "back" there? And it's very important to understand that this is largely what we're talking about when we talk about this issue. Most of the differences, most of the variants are at this level, where it hardly matters, right? It's very important to understand that. But I think this does expose an issue with the way the entire approach that we have today to textual criticism. It's resulting in verses in our Greek text that we don't have a single manuscript anywhere that says that. Let's look at some arguments for the Byzantine text family. The first is the location of the Byzantine text. I said before that Alexandrian texts have only been found in that small area there around Alexandria, but the Byzantine text is found all throughout the Byzantine Empire, and not only is that a big area, really big area, but it's an important area. Notice, if you look at this map, here we have in this kind of beige color, this is the Byzantine Empire. I bet you'll recognize some of the cities that are listed here. There's Ephesus, Smyrna. What else do we have? We've got Laodicea, and over here we have Philippi, and Thessalonica, and Corinth. This is the area where the original New Testament was written to. So when these letters were written, when Paul wrote the letter to Corinth, it ended up here, and they kept it there, and copies were made from there. And the same thing with Ephesians, and Rome is over here, and so on. Like, this is the area that the Byzantine text came from. So even though we said before that the Alexandrian manuscripts are older, the ones that we found, that is. They weren't. That's not the original location where these letters would have been written. They would have been written in this area, and copies would have been made here and checked against the autographs. The autographs would have lasted for a few hundred years, most likely, and the copies that were made and passed through this region would have been checked very easily with the autographs, which were nearby. All right, a few more arguments for the Byzantine text. First of all, the early and the tremendous dominance. Why? There's got to be some historical explanation for that. Again, we're saying that the vast majority of all Greek manuscripts that have ever been discovered have been of this one Byzantine family. And we're saying that this took place. The Byzantine text took over and became dominant very early in the 4th century. How did that happen? There's got to be an explanation for that. If scholars are going to argue that vast dominant majority is actually not closest to the original, but some small local minority is, there has to be an explanation as to how this error came to pass. And Westcott and Hort saw the need for that. They offered an explanation. They said it was a church council that made a revision, an authorized revision, but that has been debunked historically, and there's no theory that's replaced it. So it seems to me that in the absence of some explanation, it's very likely that the majority text that has come to dominate historically from very early on is closest to the original. Another interesting argument is that the Byzantine text is a sort of medium text in between the Alexandrian and the Western. Remember we said before that the Alexandrian family is characterized by being shorter and more difficult. The Western is characterized by being more elaborate and paraphrased, and the Byzantine is somewhere in between. Now, there's no textual criticism that can be compared with that of the New Testament. As far as manuscripts go, there's just the New Testament is in a class all by itself. But the only other ancient text that's even anywhere in the same ballpark is that of Homer, and scholars do textual criticism of Homer's writing as well. And when it comes to the writing of Homer, there's actually 3 distinct textual families as well. There's a shorter Alexandrian text. There's a more elaborate paraphrased text, and then there's a medium text. And interestingly, textual scholars favor the medium text. They think that the Alexandrian text was actually the result of a revision to make it more concise, and that there actually historically they understand that there was a school, a textual critical school in Alexandria, which really took seriously sort of the art of preserving manuscripts, and they valued sort of briefness and conciseness rather than elaborate paraphrase. And so modern scholars believe that that Alexandrian shorter text for Homer is actually not as original because it's been intentionally shortened, and that the medium text is actually the most original. It's interesting that text critical scholars take the exact opposite view when it comes to Homer that they do when it comes to the New Testament. There's tremendous agreement between the Byzantine manuscripts. Not perfect, not total, but these manuscripts, thousands of them, that are all descended from different original copies, at least it seems to be the case, they have remarkable agreement, which I think, though some scholars would try to argue that that's because they were intentionally copied to match each other. I think you could make the case that it's because they're a better representation of the original, as opposed to the Alexandrian manuscripts that vary a lot more with each other. I also think that it's important to consider God's providence in the matter. God has the text that his people have used throughout church history has been the Byzantine text. And I think it's entirely possible that there's a more accurate text found in Alexandria earlier on that people have not really had access to. Because like I said, it doesn't really affect a whole lot. But I do think that there should be a compelling case in my mind that should be made as to why we should overthrow the clear providence of God in preserving what we call the Byzantine text compared to to what we have there in Alexandria, and I don't see that compelling case. All right, what are the conclusions we can make from looking at these things? First thing I would say is we just don't know for sure. God tells us in His Word, the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things that have been revealed belong to us. God has not, I don't think, revealed to us in His Word exactly which family of manuscripts is closest to the original. I think He does expect us to consider these things and think through these things and pray through these things. But there's some people who quote verses, some certain verses out of context, that suggests that God has to preserve His Word in a certain way, so that we know for sure every single variant which one is right. The fact is that that's just not true. God has not promised to preserve His Word a certain way. We might not like the way that He's preserved it, but we have to let Him be God and let Him do what He is pleased to do, and not insist that He has to do things the way that we think would be right. Secondly, and I think this is one of the most important things that I want to say, there is no satanic conspiracy to corrupt God's Word. Westcott and Hort may not have been evangelical Christians, but there's no evidence that they were on a satanic mission to try to corrupt and destroy God's Word. Modern textual critics and translators of the NIV and the ESV and the NASB and other modern translations, I know of some of these men, who they are, and many of them, just based on my own knowledge about them, is that they are godly evangelical men. They're not part of a satanic conspiracy to corrupt or pervert God's Word. And, I said before, we just don't know for sure about which manuscripts. We don't know for sure. We can make judgments, and God wants us to do that, but we don't know for sure. One thing we do know for sure is that slander is of the devil. Slander is satanic. And for people to say that translators of the NIV or ESV or people compiling the modern critical text are doing it maliciously, they're doing it in a way to pervert God's Word intentionally. They're trying to remove the divinity of Christ or things like that. Not only is that absurd, but that is wicked slander. And that's far more important that we get that right than it is that we get these textual variants right. And I would just finally conclude by saying, is the critical text, the text that's based largely off the Alexandrian manuscripts, is that legitimate? Is it justified? Is it justified to take, all the centuries of Christianity and all the thousands of manuscripts that we have that are substantially Byzantine, almost all since the 4th century on, Byzantine, and to say now actually all those are not really closest to the original. Actually, it's the small minority in this one location from back in the first couple of centuries in Alexandria. Is that justified? Is it justified to go through variant by variant and piece verses together, kind of like Frankenstein, and create verses that don't exist anywhere in any manuscript that we've ever had? I don't think that that's justified. I don't think the evidence points that way. I don't think that that's the right way to go about it, in my opinion. But better men than I disagree, and it's not. This is certainly not a first level issue. So I'll let you all make the conclusion that you feel led to make.